A warm welcome to you all. My name is Anna Trendafilidu. I hold the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at TMU, and I'm delighted to have this book book discussion today on the governance of religious diversity in new analysis. Before we start, I'd like to do the land acknowledgement, at least for those of us who connect from Canada and particularly from Toronto. We're gathering here today in Toronto. That is the Dish with One Spoon territory, the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga tribes. And it is a beautiful message that Indigenous peoples share with us in terms of the Dish with One Spoon, because we are all invited in peace to cherish the land and to use the natural resources. However, with due respect to the generations that came before us since time immemorial, but also the generations that come after us. And I think this is particularly timely today with all the extreme weather events that we're witnessing around the world, and also in Canada and elsewhere. I just also want to add a word about my positionality. I'm also new to Canada. I came to Canada 5 years ago, and in that sense, I'm a settler, but also as a migration scholar, I'm in that particular a bit tense, but also important position in trying to reconcile, migration studies that in a way advocate for the right of people to move across lands, and who also remind us that migration has always been part and parcel of human history. People have always moved, and our human development is also largely due to that. And at the same time, this does not do away, actually reinforces our commitment to truth and reconciliation in Canada, where settlement has happened under horrible conditions for the Indigenous peoples. Anyhow, without further ado, I'd like to open the floor to this book launch. I want to just share some words of introduction. The book that Tariq, Modood, and Thomas Seeley are presenting today, The Governance of Religious Diversity in New Analysis, is, I believe, the intellectual outcome, not, the project outcome, one of those things that you promise in, in project proposals to get the funding, but actually the true intellectual outcome of over 4 years of work that we have conducted together as part of a Horizon Europe research project with the acronym GREECE, nothing to do with the film. It was about the governance of religious diversity, precisely. And the project aimed to see what we can learn, particularly in Europe, from countries outside the European continent and the ways they deal with religious diversity. And of course, to reflect on some both contemporary but also diachronic issues about how we create respect and accommodation for religious diversity in democratic and liberal societies, what are the limits of secularism, and how we can go beyond these limits. And it's also interesting that these conversations Tariq and I have had for over 20 years. I'm not sure we found the good solutions, but we're always trying. But also I have to say that when as you can imagine, it takes time for projects to apply, to get the funding to do the project. So probably the very concrete thinking of that work started maybe 6 years ago, in 2017 or 18, when we saw that call for proposals. And things have changed around the world in, I don't want to say in a pessimistic view, in a negative ways, in both the positive and negative ways, notwithstanding the pandemic in between, but in terms of even my original enthusiasm about, for instance, Indian multiculturalism, and unfortunately the turn that it has taken. But also I remember Tariq and I were talking about what would Charles do, now King Charles, what Prince Charles would do when the time would come for his coronation, as he had the strong commitment to respect for all the religious communities and all the ethnic communities in the UK. So this is just to give some words of background. Through this project, I've been very happy not only to work with Tariq, but also to meet a new colleague, Thomas Seeley, who started as the main researcher at the time of the Bristol team in the project, but is now a lecturer or assistant professor. I'm not sure what is the term now used at Bristol, and has actually done some enormous and significant work both in helping us delve into the comparative perspectives of the project, but also to think conceptually, engage with new ideas. So I'm delighted to have both of them actually giving us first a brief overview of the book, which I would invite you also to have, to have a look online, and if possible, suggest to your libraries to buy. And I'm also delighted to have our research area lead in labor migration, Marcia Akbar, who will be sharing some comments after the presentation. And obviously then we will open the floor to questions and comments, both from the room. From the room, I'll have to rely, I think, on you, Jessica, in waving me to, and people are welcome to actually both in the room and online to write their comments in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, and we'll try to, after Marcia, shares her comments, and maybe Tariq and Thomas share a brief response. I will be summarizing the comments from the Zoom chat and the questions, so we don't open the mics in the interest also of time. We have normally we have 12:30 to 2 our time, which is 5:30 to 7 UK time, or wherever people are based. We might take, we've now, we started a few minutes later. As usual, we'll finish a few minutes later, and I look forward to an exciting discussion. So without further ado, Tariq and Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna, not just for the introduction, but for the invitation to do this book launch presentation. And indeed, as you've said, you are hardly a stranger to the book and the project that it comes out of, about which I'll say a little bit more in a moment. But first of all, I'll just say that how we're doing our presentation. So we've timed it so we should be 22 minutes each, but it's like a sandwich. I'm the bread, so on top and on bottom, as it were, and Thomas is going to present the meat if you are a carnivore, or a salad if you are a vegetarian. But anyway, it's a sandwich. So and Thomas is a lot more tech-wise than I am, so he's going to be controlling the slides. So if you keep hearing me saying things like, next slide, please, you'll understand what's happening. And in fact, let's do that. Next slide, please.
Okay.
Right, so this is the project that Anna just described, Greece. I won't go into any more details. You can see some on the screen. Anna's just mentioned them. I'll just mention that we covered 4 world regions in this project, which is on the 3rd bullet point: Europe, Middle East and North Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Australia. And in this presentation, in fact, in the book, we concentrate mainly in Europe and Southeast Asia, but within a kind of a theoretical, comparative, and normative framework. So next slide, please. And this is our book cover. As you can see, it's quite a bright, splashy color. And if you look at the bottom, you'll see that there's a code, MOS 30, that gives you 30% discount if you go on the Polity Books website. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's get properly started. So this is our theoretical framework. The first thing to say, in case there's any doubt, is that our theme is political secularism, not metaphysical. So it's nothing to do with, does God exist? Is there life after this one? And it's nothing to do with personal lifestyles. We do not begin with a paradigmatic framework. And in fact, the main frameworks that people do often begin with are a kind of US liberal religious freedom paradigm, or a French laïcité paradigm, or sometimes holding both. We don't do that. Rather, we start with multiple secularisms. But then how to get a theoretical handle on them? Okay, they're multiple, but how do we try and understand them together theoretically and comparatively? So what we do is we start with a minimal definition of political secularism, and it really is very minimal. And then we build actual cases based on understanding what's happening in those cases. So let's begin with the minimal definition, which is highlighted in the yellow here. So it's the idea of political autonomy, namely that politics or the state has a raison d'etre of its own and should not be subordinated to religious authority, religious purposes, or religious reasons. So one thing to note straight away, in case it's not obvious, we don't mention religious freedom in our definition. For a lot of people, they think secularism is about religious freedom. We don't. And we illustrate, that by saying, well, look at the cases of USSR and China. They're clearly secularist states. They said they were, and nobody has ever said they were not or are not. But they exercise what we might call a one-way autonomy. That is to say, the autonomy of politics or the state, but without allowing organized religion, a corresponding autonomy. But that is a form of secularism. It's not the only form of secularism, and we're not saying it is a secularism that we want to promote. But nevertheless, we should recognize that secularism, at its most basic, doesn't grant religion an autonomy and so falls short of liberal secularism, which of course is a version of secularism, but is not to be confused with all versions of secularism or secularism per se. So that's our theoretical framework. And on the next slide, please, we have our analytical framework. So our unit of analysis is a country or a polity, or as some people might say, a state, like Britain, Canada, Germany, and so on. Our focus is not only on constitutions or laws, power relations, nor mere discourse or concepts, but on operative norms. That is to say, norms that can be identified as actually governing the situation or governing how a country manages its relations with religion or with a diversity of religions. For example, a norm of religious freedom is very common in many countries of the world. A norm that religions are free to do certain things, but not other things. For example, interfere in politics. That's quite a widespread norm as well. It may not be in law, but it's a norm that politicians and religious people and the public in general may observe. And we divide these operative norms into two. You'll see from the next bullet point, we call one of them dominant operative norms, or DONs. We say they do most of the work or constitute the center of gravity in a particular country, in a particular mode of secularism. But they don't do all the work. There's another layer of norms that we call qualifying operative norms, or QONs. And they are also doing some of the work, i.e. they're still operative, but they're not as powerful as the dominant norms, but they can make a difference to how the dominant norms work. So just to emphasize again, we're not concerned with legal status. DONs and QONs are not legal necessarily. They may be laws, they often are, of course. They're a product of history and can fade away. So that means they're contingent. And you can get different combinations of DONs and QONs, and they can change over time. Okay, so that's your first bit of bread. Now we turn to the stuffing of the sandwich, and I'll let Thomas get on with that.
Thanks, Tariq. I'll leave the analogy alone for now. But yeah, so what I'm going to do over the next, for my stuffing bit, is make my way through the different modes that make up the typology we develop and highlight some of their key features. And I'm going to do so by discussing them in relation to the country cases that we kind of develop them from as part of the Greece project, and that we discuss them in much greater detail in the book. So I'm going to start. I should probably say ignore the numbers. This is the way I've sliced them for the purposes of this is slightly different from the order they appear in the book. So just ignore that says number 2. This is the first one we're going to focus on. And we're going to start with a mode that we call secularist statism, and which we developed and mainly discuss in relation to France. And a kind of key law here in France that kind of gets a handle on what kind of underpins this mode is France's 1905 law on separation, which is enshrined in the constitution and has been commented that it has the status of a cultural icon, approaching in importance and on a level with the constitution, such is the way it's seen in France. So this sets out that freedom of conscience is an absolute right, but it is quite restrictive and provides quite a restrictive set of norms when it comes to public religion and state religion connections, where religion is largely confined to the private sphere and the state exerts a good deal of control. Headscarf affairs are well known and a kind of a very good example of this. And of course, most recently, we saw with the Olympics how French athletes were banned from wearing the hijab when they were competing. And so that's an example of the restriction to the private sphere of religious signs and symbols and their kind of public expression. So here religion is seen predominantly in kind of more negative terms, and a significant aspect of the job of state institutions and of public bodies is securing systems, equality and freedom from and outside of religion. So equality in the French conception is secured through a kind of republican egalitarian individualism, where difference, religious, ethnic or cultural, is seen to threaten this and therefore is restricted to the private sphere. And so another feature that follows is that, as we find in France, there are stronger ties between secularism, or in the case of France specifically, laïcité, and the idea of national identity. And France has, over the years, cemented laïcité to its sense of nationhood. It is, for example, the only EU state to explicitly define itself as secular in its constitution. And in 2021, the French state announced the creation of an interministerial committee on laïcité to ensure, to quote it, the respect and promotion of laïcité by all public institutions. Now, this doesn't preclude connections. And so secularist statism isn't necessarily oriented or defined by an absence of connections between state and religion, but it's the character of the connections and the kind of level of state control and interference that characterises those connections that's more significant here. So in France, legal institutional status has been granted to representative bodies for Catholics, Protestants, Jews and Muslims. This comes with some exemptions and assistance in access to some public spaces and for places of worship. There are state-paid chaplains who operate in public schools, prisons, hospitals and military and so on. And there are faith-based private schools and hospitals that can be eligible for some government funding, providing they meet appropriate criteria. But the emphasis here is that in this mode, these kinds of connections are quite restricted and they are characterised by greater state interference and control. So obtaining the status of religion rather than just being an association is difficult and requires the State Council to undertake a substantive review of the purposes and practices of the organisation. The state interferes to a large degree, in majority as well as minority, in the appointment of bishops, employees, in schools that receive state support, and so on. And of course, we've seen in recent years very high levels of interference, especially applied to Muslim organisations, which have faced closure for not signing a declaration that their value is aligned with those of the Republic and this kind of thing. A contrasting mode, and the second one we're going to look at here, is one that we also developed primarily in relation to countries in Western Europe. And this is called moderate secularism. And here the country cases that we use for this are the UK, Germany and Belgium as our main examples. As with France, for moderate secularism, freedom of religion as freedom of conscience is guaranteed as an absolute right. But each of these countries has much stronger ties between state and religion and state support, albeit of different sorts between them. The UK, or England more precisely, is the only case from these three where there is a formally established church, although there are other Western European countries that also have established churches, such as Norway, Denmark and Finland, which has 2. What this means is, in the case of the Church of England at least, is that it retains certain privileges. 26 seats in the House of Lords are reserved for Anglican bishops, and it maintains a very prominent role in certain national events such as royal weddings, funerals and coronations, and we've seen a few of these in the last few years. So the position of religion more generally, not just the established church, is secured through other forms of legislation. In England, this is, or certainly an important part of that here, is the Charities Act 2011, where the advancement of religion is recognised as a charitable purpose, and it is often through gaining charitable status that financial benefits in terms of tax relief and this kind of thing are open to religious bodies. And most churches and other places of worship, mosques, temples and so on, and a range of other types of religious organisations register as charities for in these kinds of ways. In Germany, it's a little bit different, where the German Basic Law establishes a formal separation between church and state, barring any kind of legal establishment. But it also contains constitutional guarantees of state religion connections. It retains subsidies and privileges for the Protestant and Catholic churches, and a kind of codified cooperation between church and state, especially in the areas of education and welfare. And this comes primarily through gaining the status of a corporation under public law. And the number of groups that have been granted this status has grown and diversified in recent decades. In Belgium, there's not quite the same formal constitutional separation, but a variety of religions are granted official recognition and strong connections remain. And the Catholic Church has quite a symbolic prominence in national events and things like this. So these kinds of routes to formal recognition in all 3 countries are available to a number of religions and have been extended to newer minorities as well as humanist groups. So there's also a kind of recognition of the non-religious as part of this kind of governance in a wider sense. Institutional connections have been expanded in different ways. For instance, in Germany, the German Islam conferences, which began in 2006, have sought to bring together government ministries and departments with Muslim organisations to facilitate institutional dialogue and improve this kind of support and communication for issues that Muslims face in Germany. And in the UK, there's been more of a bottom-up emergence, representing what Tariq elsewhere has called a democratic constellation in terms of how the state relates to a variety of different groups. 2 really significant areas where this idea of religion, state religion connections and religion playing a kind of positive role in the public sphere are education and welfare service provision. In terms of welfare service provision, it's probably not too much of an exaggeration to say that state welfare would be severely disabled, if not collapse, without the roles and partnerships between the state and faith-based organisations. That's certainly the case in Germany and the UK. Religions also play an important role in education, where they operate in public school systems, providing religious instruction in the case of Germany, or through faith schools in England and Wales that operate with government funding. These, moreover, have generally increased in the last couple of decades, even if Christian-based schools continue to kind of predominate. So in the main, for moderate secularism in relation to these countries, we can say that through this kind of cooperation and the norms that go into them, this goes well beyond a privatised view of religion in society as merely a matter of individual conscience. Religion is seen as a public good, providing significant public services, and is supported by the state in these areas. It's not all a kind of positive story of harmony and joy, of course, and these types of measures have not been without significant criticism and controversy. These things are very uneven at times, and forms of regulation and interference are certainly evident. Of course, in recent years, Muslims have been at the forefront of various controversies of this kind, and mosques and Muslim organisations have faced greater scrutiny, interference and conditions, and in a context characterised by fears over Islamist extremism, policies of securitisation have come to mark in important ways state Muslim relations specifically. Nevertheless, this kind of regulation and interference as such is a feature of moderate secularism. Moderate secularism doesn't kind of bar these kinds of things. And it's important that what we see in these countries is that while the regulative aspects have become enhanced, perhaps, this has happened in a way that hasn't actually really called into question the public good function of religion or of the kinds of state-religion connections that are evident as a result. And in national identity terms too, secularism is not elevated in the same way as it is under secularist statism. So the tensions have been heightened, and particularly in relation to Muslims, but the wider sense of the type of state-religion connections and those norms, they still hold. So our third mode is what we call liberal neutralism. And we primarily, or what I'm certainly going to do here and in the book, is we talk about this more as a kind of a set of qualifying norms in relation to Australia, or where we have a combination of moderate secularism and liberal neutralism. So we can say a little bit how that combination looks in relation to Australia, and therefore what the features of liberal neutralism are by contrast. So Australia cultivated a multiculturalism, and in the earlier years of this, state support and accommodation of religious groups was very significant to this. But this is perhaps strongest at state and territory levels, where we find more pronounced kind of norms and features of moderate secularism. So at state and territory levels, there are a range of Commonwealth agency-based funding programmes for religious and cultural groups. And funds are made available to minority ethno-religious groups for things like the expansion of the provision for religious instruction in government schools in order to reflect more recent diversity and this kind of thing. Of course, because this happens at the state and territory level, it is uneven in how it appears across and between them. At the national level is where we can see some of these kind of features and norms of liberal neutralism operating a bit more strongly. The Australian Constitution treats religious beliefs and practices as voluntary and private matters for all its citizens, and there are weaker positive protections and connections for religious rights and freedoms in comparison to the three Western European countries I've just talked about under moderate secularism. A recent significant development kind of highlights this interplay between the two modes quite well. And this was the 2018 Religious Freedoms Review. So here the Australian government stated that freedom of religion is not subordinate to other freedoms, and, to quote the Australian government, accepts that there is an opportunity to further protect and better promote and balance the right to freedom of religion under Australian law and in the public sphere. So this is kind of speaking the language of moderate secularism, we might say. However, this bill has been hotly contested on more liberal neutralist grounds. And in fact, the Religious Discrimination Act has stalled. It passed the lower house, but it got stuck at the Senate. And this was really owing to tensions with how religious freedoms were held in relation to other forms of equalities, such as sex and sexuality discrimination rights, which was seen, and enhanced religious freedoms were seen to encroach too much upon those rights. And so it's kind of got stuck. But there you can see, hopefully, these two modes kind of speaking to each other in an interesting way. So, another of our modes, and here we switch kind of geographical context quite a lot. Another of our modes is called pluralistic nationalism. And this is one that we develop and discuss in relation to 3 country cases in South and Southeast Asia: India, Indonesia, and Malaysia. So here, independence from colonial rule, religious diversity and governance was a key factor and occupied a central concern for those drafting new constitutions for these newly formed countries, and where they devised, to borrow a phrase from Alfred Stepan, innovative formulas of accommodation to create a sense of national unity, but one with diversity at its heart. And this, a significant part of what this meant, was acknowledging the significance and centrality of religion to the life worlds of its populations, and also trying to guard against majoritarian dominance of minorities, especially minorities who are kind of a deep historic connection and presence on the land. The Indian Constitution adopted the principle of no establishment and gave equal rights to all citizens. Yet in other ways it steered away from a liberal secular framework and permitted a much greater mingling of state and religion to reflect the religious diversity of the country. In Indonesia and Malaysia, a significant part of the independent settlements were the development of national philosophies, which asserted the centrality of religion to each, whilst also establishing a foundation of unity out of the pluralism. So their constitutions sought a kind of middle position between, on the one hand, those who were kind of pushing and arguing for something that would have been more recognisably liberal secular, and on the other hand, those who aspired for the countries to, both being Muslim majority countries, to be more explicitly Islamic. But a middle position was kind of taken. In Malaysia, Islam was made the religion of the federation, but this was conceived primarily as a ceremonial thing within the secular conception of the state and how the state would operate. In terms of freedom of religion, though, what we see, and in stark kind of, or in quite a bit of contrast to the modes already discussed, is an emphasis on groups and what has been called institutional religious freedom as a significant kind of norm. And forms of accommodations, institutional accommodations and state religion connections were established across spheres, including education, places of worship, as well as through mechanisms of policy consultation and influence to a stronger degree. In all 3 countries, albeit in different ways, there are forms of legal pluralism, and these are drawn along lines of religious community, and through which the different religious communities can operate according to personal law codes of that religious community, especially in relation to aspects of family law, marriages, divorces, and this kind of thing. In India, differentiated legal codes were accommodated for matters relating to family law, and successive post-independence governments have been, by and large, reluctant to intervene in religious practices, even when these might clash with other principles and equalities such as gender equality or personal autonomy. In Muslim majority Malaysia and Indonesia, in slightly different ways, but they both have plural legal systems which establish some separation between Islamic courts for Muslims in some areas and matters, as well as a general legal system for everything else. So this also entails a conception of equality that's markedly different from the modes we've already seen. The operative premises in these cases are based on the idea that living with diversity requires something much more than granting the same basic rights to all citizens. And an emphasis on moral groupism can be weighed more heavily than individualism. And this kind of provides this contrast. This can create some kind of tensions between one's official state-sanctioned religious identity and one's perhaps own sense of religious identification or faith. In both Malaysia and Indonesia, atheism is not formally recognised, and a religious identity will be assigned based on the ethno-religious community that that person belongs to, and this is what will appear on ID cards. And conversion from one religion to another can be extremely difficult and needs to go through the courts. And in cases where there is a tension between individual and group-based rights are often favoured, and this can have significant implications, especially for women and what get called minorities within minorities. Our final mode is one that I'm also going to discuss in relation to India, Indonesia and Malaysia. And this one is one that we suggest presents significant qualifying norms in relation to pluralistic nationalism. In the book, we do briefly discuss some cases where majoritarian nationalism forms the dominant operative norms, but here we're going to do them as qualifying operative norms to further go into a bit more detail on India, Indonesia and Malaysia and the context there. So this mode is majoritarian nationalism, and we might say that this is the least forgiving of our modes when it comes to religious diversity and freedom. And a core feature of how this becomes expressed and how we see its features in these country examples is that all three have seen strong assertions of ethno-religious nationalisms connected to the religion of the majority, in a way that this religion has come to be seen as more definitional of the country and of its citizens, with some not so good kind of implications and results and consequences for minorities and for diversity. In Malaysia, the passage of time since its formation has blurred this initial secular and pluralistic intentions of the framers of the constitution and the original intention of the statement that Islam is the religion of the federation. And this has come to provide a basis for those who push for Malaysia to become a more explicitly Islamic state. In Indonesia too, various groups have sought a more exclusionist interpretation, which holds that the spirit of the country is more properly Islamic. Although it seems that in Indonesia, the state philosophy of Pancasila is perhaps slightly more robust than in Malaysia in terms of being able to hold back, and official political parties and large organisations do still tend to subscribe to the state philosophy of unity and diversity. However, there have been significant processes in both Indonesia and Malaysia of Islamisation or Shariaisation, where formal legal and policy measures, as well as political and social discourses and narratives, have increasingly come to reflect and assert Muslim and Islamic dominance. And it's been observed by some that this has, they've even, some particularly powerful organisations have even been able to effectively capture parts of the state through which they can push these agendas. So these majoritarian pressures have increased the scale of restrictions on minority religious expression in public and non-public spaces. And this doesn't just relate to non-Muslim minorities and diversity, but can also relate to Muslim groups who are not kind of the officially orthodox Sunni Islam of the state or territory, and which can themselves be labelled as deviant. In India, there's been a greater assertion of the idea that Hindu culture is identified as Indian culture, and a kind of more homogenising drive, pushing for greater space for this in the public domain. This has greatly intensified under the BJP since they became the ruling party in the mid-2010s, and with the political ideology of Hindutva at its core. There have been numerous and consistent instances of violence and other forms of targeting, such as economic boycotts, that have been directed against minorities, especially Christians, and perhaps more especially Muslims. And this has operated in the kind of informal and social sphere, but also through the government, senior political leaders and local police, who have often been active and complicit in the erosion of the a kind of pluralistic form. Just one kind of example here is the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, which provided a pathway to Indian citizenship for religious minorities who arrived in India before 2014 from neighbouring countries. And it provided this for Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis and Christians, but it did not extend this to Muslims from these countries. And this was the first time that religion had been overtly used as a criterion for citizenship under Indian law. So that's another example of the kind of direction of travel and how features of majoritarian nationalism are eroded aspects of pluralistic nationalism. And that kind of concludes that overview, and I'll hand back to Tariq, who's going to take on a couple of these modes in particular to develop the kind of normative thing that we go for afterwards.
Thank you, Thomas. So we argue that there is different kinds of secularism across the globe. There's not a single paradigm. But how should we then evaluate the multiplicity of cases, some of which have just been presented to you, especially in a context of religious diversity within a country? Liberals tend to evaluate a country, a secularism in terms of individual freedom based on state neutrality, which actually, as we've seen, doesn't really exist very much. It's certainly far from the norm. And some liberals, because of that, have begun to move away from that. We suggest, however, that individual freedom should just be an aspect of the basis of evaluation. The evaluation should also include respect for religion, because we don't want to just end up with a relativist position, hence why we think we need a normative standard or a normative framework for evaluating these cases. So some kind of respect for religion has to be part of our evaluation. Well, what kind of respect? How do we respect other kinds of group identities? Let's begin there. So we begin with the idea of multicultural respect. So multicultural respect involves an idea of recognition, recognizing that a group has its own identity, its own sense of itself, and which is connected to various kinds of practices, which should then be accommodated in the public space, should be accommodated in schools, in workplaces, in sometimes in welfare provisions, and certainly in hospitals and old people's homes and so on. So there should be institutional accommodation as well as in politics and parliament and so on. So that means we have a concept of equality, which is about individual equality, but also about group recognition and accommodation. So it's a double aspected concept of equality. Equality as sameness in some contexts and recognition or respect for difference in other contexts. And that actually is the multiculturalist concept of equality. Equality as sameness and difference. people should not just be free to have these identities, but to have them publicly recognized and accommodated and supported. But that'll mean supported in different ways, because the religious groups will themselves differ in various kinds of ways. For example, some groups like Muslims and Jews and Hindus have dietary requirements that that will have to be respected in public institutions like schools, hospitals, prisons, of course, and so on, but also in large or medium-sized workplaces. You know, the provision of halal meat, for instance. But not all religions have dietary requirements. So where they don't have them or don't want them, a certain kind of provision, no religious group should be forced to have a provision just because another religious group has asked for it. That's part of what we mean by multiculturalism, that there is a multiplicity, that you can't have a one standard, one size fits all. So we have to have anti-discrimination. Discrimination against any religious group should be unlawful, as is other kinds of discrimination, like gender discrimination, racial discrimination, and so on. But also, we need an active program led by the state, but also in civil society, of de-othering, of not seeing religious groups, just like, you know, racial groups or sexualized groups, you know, LGBTQ plus range of groups, as othered, as something alien, deviant, as something inferior, as groups to be avoided. And that's something the state should lead on, but also it's a project that can be taken up by various civil society organization and agencies. And we should have positive identity inclusion within the national, which again is a fundamental multiculturalist idea. Inclusion of groups that previously have been marginalized or inferiorized in relation to race and ethnicity, for instance. So we're saying exactly the same in relation to our concept of multiculturalism as the basis for evaluating different modes of secularism. And in order to do so, we offer two principles, the first of which is on the next slide, Thomas. Here we are. We call this the principle of identification. And actually, these principles were first developed by Simon Thompson and I in an article somewhere else, and we use them in our book here. Thomas and I use them. So the principle of identification is that the state should strive to enable citizens to identify with their political community. Such identification is good for both intrinsic and instrumental reasons. Why? Well, firstly, the intrinsic reasons, citizens benefit from being able to identify with their political community. It's good for individuals to feel that they're part of that community. That is our view. But secondly, also, there are instrumental reasons. If all groups, if all people, all citizens can identify with their political community, it's actually easier for certain goals to be achieved. Goals to do with, for instance, public order or civil peace, security and anti-extremism and so on. So that's our first principle, the principle of identification, which we think has a good basis, good sound basis, both for intrinsic and instrumental reasons. But we have one more principle, which is on the next slide, thank you, principle of discretionary recognition. We say that a state may give additional recognition, additional to the recognition through the first principle of identification, may give additional recognition to one or more religions. That is to say, it may do so above that level required for identification. A variety of reasons may be given for such discretionary recognition. What reasons? Well, things like the historic importance of that religious group, religious community, to the life of a particular country. And not just historic, but its significance for national identity today and the kind of national identity we're developing into tomorrow, into the future for the next generation. The social contribution that organized religions made, as you saw from the presentations that Thomas made in different countries, religious groups are very actively involved in making a social contribution in civil society, in welfare provision, even when they're not funded by the state, in things like charitable giving, food banks, for instance, we see a lot of in Britain, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case also in Canada, but in a number of countries, religious-based organizations are very heavily involved in making a social contribution. And what kind of organizations might then be given this discretionary recognition based on things like historic importance, significance for national identity and social contribution? Well, the Church of England could be one. Indeed is one in Britain. Sunni Islam is also another example in countries that we've been discussing, like Indonesia and Malaysia, for instance. But there's a very important condition. So besides these two principles, there's a condition that relates to the operation of the principles, which is on the next slide. And that's what we call a lexical priority. So lexical, like in a dictionary, A always comes before B, which comes before C. I mean, that is how a dictionary must be ordered. That's a lexical ordering. So similarly, we say there is a lexical priority. And the priority is, it's a one-way priority, like in a dictionary. The first principle, that is the principle of identification, all groups, covering all religious groups. The first principle has lexical priority over the second principle. So discretionary recognition is impermissible if it threatens identification. So we have to have a secure platform of identification in operation, the recognition, multiculturalist recognition and accommodation. And if we can have that in operation, then we argue that granting discretionary recognition doesn't necessarily undermine the latter. Then it is permissible. It may not be in some contexts. This is not a universal rule. It is what's permissible, what may be allowed in certain cases in accordance with our normative evaluation. So we say, if and when it does not undermine the principle of identification, then discretionary recognition is legitimate. And this should be established through democratic dialogue. Next slide, please. So just to spell out some of the strengths or a virtue of our position. So we say that any special or privileged recognition is a matter of democratic debate, because recognition is a matter of democratic debate. It is compatible with and so leaves open for debate a number of positions. For instance, it leaves open for debate mono or multi-establishment, or indeed no establishment, as long as our criteria are met. you know, the principle of identification and the principle of discretionary recognition and so on. So yeah, as long as those criteria are met, so we're not evaluating on the basis of, oh, do you have this institution? We're evaluating on the basis of, are you following these principles or these special multiculturalist norms? Because if you are, then we can be a lot more flexible about what institutions are possible, whether they're mono or multi-establishment or no establishment. So what distinguishes us is that we do not hold either of these two positions that follow underneath. Some people hold this view, we don't. So they say in a multicultural secular democracy, mono-establishment, you know, like the Church of England, that's a mono-establishment, because only one established church in the whole of the United Kingdom. They say that can never be justified. Well, obviously, that's not our view. We think in certain circumstances, it can be justified. The second position we don't hold is when people say in a multicultural secular democracy, differential recognition, you know, symbolic recognition, legally, resource provision, and so on. Those things can never be justified. That's a kind of liberal religion blindness, or if you like, difference blindness principle. We certainly don't take that view. We say it all depends on the historic importance, the significance for national identity, and the social contribution, and perhaps other factors as well, all of which are open to debate. So just to move to a finish, got 2 slides left, I believe. Thank you. So here very quickly, some political implications, very briefly, what we're saying. So we want to say that both moderate secularism and pluralistic nationalism need to work harder to achieve the principle of identification. Specifically, moderate secularism, so that's the secularism of countries mainly like Western Europe and to some extent Australia, and I think to some extent Canada, that moderate secularism needs to be thickened so as to include minorities as respected equals. And the second implication is this time about pluralistic nationalism. That is the mode of secularism that we say is operative in some form or other, to some degree or other, is operative in India, Malaysia, and Indonesia. We say it needs to be thinned. It's a bit paradoxical, it's the opposite. So moderate secularism needs to be thickened to include plurality, but pluralistic nationalism needs to be thinned to allow more individual freedom, and it needs to better defend the rights of minorities, and it needs to lessen religious domination and state authoritarianism, which, as you saw in Thomas's presentation, is something that is happening very clearly in the case of India, but actually also in the case of Malaysia, and to some extent, even also in the case of Indonesia. All three of them are moving at different rates and to different degree, are moving from a kind of pluralistic nationalism to a kind of authoritarian, a majoritarian nationalism. And of course, we want to see that reversed in terms of our evaluative perspective. To the extent that this thinning happens, each mode then can exercise discretionary recognition if supported by a democratic consensus. So that's very briefly 2 political implications for 2 different modes of secularism, the 2 that we've focused on in our book. So thank you very much for your patience. It's been quite a long presentation, but we have come to the end, and we're looking forward to discussion and then to a more open Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tariq. It's been indeed a very thorough presentation. I'm myself familiar with the comparative aspects, and thank you, Thomas, for actually giving us in a short time an overview of a lot of work that has gone into this, trying to fit very different country realities and national models into a theoretical classification, and then carry this forward. I would like to give the floor directly to Marcia for some comments. And again, we take it from there. Depending on how long Marcia's comments will be, I may give you a chance to react or open the floor to more questions and then turn to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My comments will be quite brief. So I'm gonna open the floor to the audience for questions very soon, but I would like to share some of the themes that intrigued me about this book. First of all, it's a pleasure and honor to be discussant for this amazing and very timely book, The New Governance of Religious Diversity by Tariq Modood and Thomas Seeley. I haven't met Thomas in person, but I met Tariq a few times, and every time we had a discussion, I saw the passion and the enthusiasm that he has for both theoretical and analytical perspectives on the accommodation of religious diversity within the society, equity and equality among different religious groups. So this book reflects both of their passion for this topic as well as commitment to create a better society for all religious groups. So some of my comments are based on, first of all, the value of this book within this current context when we see growing tensions and very anti-immigrant sentiments and rhetorics regarding different religious groups. Particularly, we see Islamophobia, we see anti-Semitism rising in different countries. Almost all continents, we are seeing a kind of that kind of rhetorics coming up, including Canada, which we thought would be immune to this kind of rhetoric. So within this context, I would say that this book would really create a platform to engage in discussion about tolerance, about accommodating religious diversity, acknowledging religious differences, respect for religious differences at the state level as well as at different spheres in society. This book has a huge contribution, theoretical contribution, in terms of creating a critical perspective on political secularism. And Tariq talked, both presenters talked about this in detail. So I would say that it goes beyond the meta-theoretical discussion to more empirical, like day-to-day lived experiences by bringing empirical and the normative together. So it's not just what is there in terms of discourse, but what's actually happening in the societies of the countries that were selected for this study. It's great that the study looked at the operative norms. So basically what is happening in terms of comparing UK, Belgium, France in Europe, as well as Indonesia, Malaysia, and India in Southeast Asia. So the book actually provides a kind of critical perspective on Euro-America-centric idea of political secularism by bringing examples from Global South. I would say that's a big contribution of the book. So I'm going to the solution, right? So the examples that we have heard about these countries, we see on the one hand, there are differences in the degree in terms of what extent secularism or religious freedom have been accepted in different countries. But at the same time, we see some gray areas. For example, in European countries, well, to some extent, we say it's moderate secularism, or the separation between state and religion, but yet we see that religion is integrated in the school system, the prison system, and so on. In the case of India, Malaysia, Indonesia, again, as Tariq emphasized, that there's institutional acceptance of religious diversity, yet we again see the dominance of certain religious groups over others, and then inclusion and exclusion based on different religious identities, as well as gender, class, and race as well. So these gray areas actually are important in terms of contextualizing the multiculturalism, secularism idea that the both author proposed. We do have multiculturalism in Canada, and we are very proud of that, but we see some of the practical issues in terms of multiculturalism, the gaps between theoretical ideas and practice. So I would like to know more about that, like the gap that we often see in terms of is ideal that we think and what actually is happening. I really love about their idea of engaging state in terms of encouraging and even facilitating people's identification with religion, their own religion, as well as have the freedom, create a scope for freedom to practice their religious values and so on, to create create kind of peace and stability in the society. But in this regard, I'm also interested in the roles of the private actors, because is the state the most powerful actor these days? Because we see the huge influence of social media in terms of shaping narratives about different religious groups, as well as creating misinformation, disinformation, and hatred society. So how to handle that, the private actors and the social media sector in terms of making sure that the multicultural secularism idea can be actually applied in reality. I think I'm gonna stop there just to say that I really love the topic and the book. And as I say that I would like to know a little bit more about the application of multiculturalism notion, because we do face challenges in Canada in terms of the rhetoric and actually what is happening in in the labor market, what is happening in terms of racialization, structural systemic racism in Canada, that, and also the roles of other actors, non-state, like beyond state, the roles of other actors, including social media, in terms of making sure that the accommodation of religious diversity is not just theory, but practice, but reality. Thank you. So I'm going to open the floor for the audience to ask their questions. And Anna, we're going to...
Yes,
yes.
Okay. Yes, I'm going to facilitate this. And thank you for Marsha for the comments. I think, yes, it is something that I think both Thomas and Tariq have tried to do, to bring the theoretical depth in dialogue with the reality. And I think that's where Tariq was referring to his work on iterative contextualism with Simon Thompson. And I should say, yeah, I share some of Marsha's questions, but in order to complicate further the discussion, and encouraging the people in the seminar room, please write your comments or questions in the chat. But I see a question from Joe that you might be seeing as well, Tariq and Thomas, and perhaps that can help us, have a more sociological question and a more political theory question, and you can address it together. So what are the normative presuppositions that underlie the principle of identification, and how do they fit with the contemporary normative debates about multiculturalism, which I think is a different way of asking the question of how do we inform reality with your theoretical propositions. So the floor is yours to react. Tariq, your mic is off.
Thank you very much, Marsha, and thank you, Anna. I was just saying, I'll go first, and then Thomas, you come in. Well, thank you very much for your question, Joe. And in fact, what a nice What a nice thing to see you on screen. Very good of you to come to this event. What are our normative presuppositions in relation to the principle of identification? I guess I would say that we assume, I don't know whether this is quite a normative presupposition, but it's, if you like, a presupposition about how we think the world is. But there are normative aspects to follow, but the first one is really like how is the world in which any principles are going to operate. So we think that the world doesn't consist of abstract individuals. Individuals have a certain character, a certain identity. They're brought up in a certain kind of way. They speak certain kinds of languages. They have certain ideas about themselves and about other people, and so on. They have various social imaginaries that connect them, but also divide them, and so on. And while in some contexts, obviously, like law and so on, we try and deal with individuals on the basis of, same treatment or establish some kind of sameness, we think that all polities, all countries, Canada, Britain, and so on, have various underlying normative and cultural orientations. So they already shape a country in a certain kind of way. They and shaping it in that way means that they give a certain kind of importance to people who share that view, because it's easier for them to work in that cultural context. Obviously, language is a very good example. If the language of the state and the language of the school and universities and so on is a language that you're proficient in, obviously you're going to do quite well relative to someone who either doesn't have that language to the same degree of proficiency or speaks it as a non-native speaker. So given that that's the case, then multiculturalism, as I think you'd agree, Joe, is about, in a context of diversity, which really nearly all our countries, and where people have been marginalized, inferiorized historically, or their presence in substantial numbers is relatively new. So multiculturalism then says we must take these other groups, i.e. the marginalized or the new, we must take these groups and treat them in ways in which they too can identify with what will be our shared composite culture, including our sense of who we are as a country and so on. So that's, if you like, the contextual presupposition or the circumstantial presupposition. The normative presupposition is, of course, that citizenship gives something to people. Citizenship is something worth having. It's good that citizenship exists in the world. And similarly, national belonging, which often overlaps with citizenship, it's good to encourage that, but citizenship and national belonging are often exclusionary and divisive. So we must attend to citizenship and national belonging to increase their inclusivity and to eliminate their exclusive tendencies. So I would say that's the combination of a presupposition about how the world is and a presupposition about what's of value in the world. Maybe, Thomas, you'd either like to add something to that, or if you want to respond to something that Marsha said, maybe now's a good time to do it while Joe's digesting what I said.
I thought I'd do another aspect of what you just said in terms of its relating to contemporary debates about multiculturalism, and something that the two principles try to speak to and how we set them up is recent debates about the issue of majorities, which has kind of become a thing in multiculturalism in the literature recently, and how trying to kind of think about the legitimacy of the kind of privileged position of some religions in this case, but then that relation to diversity and in relation to new religions and that kind of. So that's the kind of, and there's another aspect of that I think is, I'm not sure if we really, which is there in terms of the kind of the contemporary debates, I suppose, that it somehow responds to.
I have a question or comment, if and I would encourage the people to keep writing in the chat. So my comment is, what are the theoretical comment is, what are the limits of iterative contextualism? So is everything contextual? So when you speak about, for instance, when we look at how much recognition or how much accommodation, for instance, when you were talking about the mono and multi-establishment in relation to different religions and religious groups. So is this just completely open in terms of, because you mentioned historical importance, significance for national identity, social contributions, you were mentioning that. So is that, in your view, completely important? And what are the limits of that from a theoretical or normative perspective, if there are any? And the more sociological comment is, what is, I mean, I know we're trying, on one hand, we worked, and also in the project and the work you presented, we've worked in comparative perspectives and also tried to factor in that some countries may not be liberal parliamentary democracies in the way we understand them, and there may be a strong establishment, and that's where exactly we're looking at the dominant and the operative norms. But beyond that, I was wondering, what is the role of transnational debates, and if one is to focus right now both on North America but also on Europe and the debates across the broader Europe and North America, which seem to be leading us to a second backlash against, if we had the first backlash in the 2000s, we have a second backlash right now. And one cannot ignore, I believe, the tension between norms and actually practices that exist on the ground and have been long established. And I think several of us have written about if you want, the persistence, the resilience of multiculturalism on the ground versus the change in what our norms are professed as acceptable. So any thoughts you might have?
Well, we haven't said anything in response to Marcia, so I think we should do that first, as well as to you, Anna. So I'll say something, maybe Thomas says something else, I don't know, but I'll say something in relation to a point that Marcia asked, and that was about the role of private actors. So, I mean, how one conceives of the public and private is quite a complex and difficult matter. So we use the idea of governance. Traditionally, when people have come to these questions that we're discussing here, they talk about church and state. We hardly use the term state. I personally try and avoid it whenever I can for various reasons, but governance is a term that has a little bit more elasticity than simply talking about the state, because the state is about, institutions, office holders, laws, the police, etc. Whereas governance is about organizing public space according to certain rules and by certain kinds of agencies and actors which are connected to governments, but also have some degree of delegated independence from government. So that immediately means we're stretching the idea of what one might call the public or the state into possibly some territory that other people might call, well, that's private, or certainly into civil society. And I think we did in our presentation give some examples of how this happens in countries like Britain and Germany, for instance, where religious organizations, churches, but also now, mosques, and for a long time, Jewish organized charitable activities, play quite a significant role in administering sometimes what are, in effect, extensions of social policy in certain areas. Sometimes they're expressly asked to do so by the state, especially in Germany, which has a much more a kind of a corporatist top-down arrangement. The government will give quite large budgets to the Protestant and the Catholic churches and say, please, you're very good at this. You have hospitals, you have old people's homes and so on. Please carry on doing this or do more of it. And here's the money out of the public purse, out of taxes. So when you have a Protestant church running an old people's home, it's not the state, but it's not totally private because there is this symbiotic link to taxes and policy decisions made by state actors, elected politicians, and the civil servants, and so on. So that's partly what we mean by governance, and we see this in other countries, and I'm sure it definitely must exist in Canada. So in some ways, I would respond to you, Marcia, by saying, please be careful not to work with oversimple and unrealistic understandings of public and private, which are normatively freighted with ideas that actually don't sit very well with our understanding of governance and our understanding of multiculturalism. So I'll stop there. I could come back in later, but I'll stop to give you a chance to say something, Thomas.
I might just say something quickly on another of Marcia's points, which is the grey areas. I missed the grey area on South and Southeast Asia because I was making a note of the grey area on Western Europe, and I missed that. So I'm just going to say something about the grey area you mentioned in relation to Western Europe and the idea of the issue of separation as a grey area. I mean, the way we think about this is, I mean, the idea of a pure separation is a myth. There is no country in the world where this actually exists. So what we focus on instead, our kind of point of emphasis is on, so there are always connections of some sort. Even the most secularist, so the USSR, whatever, have had at times quite strong connections between the state and religions of different sorts. But where I suppose our emphasis, what we're kind of interested in, is not trying to say yes there are connections or no there are not connections, or this, but more to look at the character of those connections. So how do those connections operate? Is it a more one-way autonomy? Is it about state control and state interference? Is that what really comes through in how these work? Or is it something more cooperative? So the examples that Tariq just gave of the state saying, well, here's some money, you do that. So that's kind of, that's a much looser kind of sense of kind of state control and this kind of stuff. So that's when it comes to kind of the issue of separation, that's what we're more interested in is, okay, what kind of connections have we got and how do those connections operate? What's the relation like? And that kind of thing, yeah.
I see that there's a new question from
Okay, first
Kevin?
of all, Yeah, I wanted to
I'll say
about
something
this
about what
question.
you said as well, Anna. So you were asking about, is there a limit? Just to remind myself, do you mean limit to cases or limit to ones that we would in some way endorse?
No, limit to the accommodations.
Yeah,
So the
okay.
iterative contextualism.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there are limits. We don't really look in a detailed way into that. You know, lots of good work does, and a lot of jurisprudence and political theory arguments are about distinguishing between cases in order to draw lines. So our study is not like that. Ours is much more perspectival. You know, what kind of perspective allows us to get a handle in understanding this particular country and how its norms of secularism and governance of diversity operate. But we're not merely describing, even in doing comparative descriptions. We are offering some evaluation because we're not relativists, and we obviously have very strong normative commitments to multiculturalism. So we even our comparative work is to some extent driven by our kind of normative orientation, because the very fact that we choose to focus on diversity. So, I mean, you might say, for instance, the issue of how much religion should be permitted in a state school, in a English state school or a Canadian state school. So here's a question about limits. And I'm sure there is a limit, but we won't necessarily all agree with it. And that means it's something important to discuss. And but we don't raise and answer questions like that. We don't say, do this much, but no more. Though in very general terms, as you saw at the end, we talk about the importance of thickening moderate secularism in a more pluralistic or multiculturalist way. And we talked about thinning pluralistic nationalism so as to give more space to personal autonomy, to sexual equality, to individuals to pursue their own understanding of what it is to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu and so on, rather than organized religious community leaders dominating the public space, as is the case in some versions of pluralistic nationalism, and in fact other modes as well. So I guess I can't answer your question. Well, I think I've answered your question insofar as it relates to our book, even if it's like batting your question away rather than directly engaging with it. I would like to say something about Steve's question. I presume everyone can see it in the chat. So basically, as I see it, there are two different questions there, or a question and a comment. One is just saying, well, what is the background, your own personal background, that brings you to this set of issues? And the other one is that we don't seem to be tackling extremism in this work, but rather some way trying to undermine the positive influence of faith communities. So I'll say a little bit about each of those things. So I was brought up as a Muslim at home, and I participated in Christian religious instruction classes and in Christian worship at school, because that's what my dad, who is a very devout Muslim, that's what he wanted me to do. I mean, you laugh at this, but his view was that some religion is better than none, and missing school assembly at the beginning of the day, religious assembly at the beginning of the day, he thought was worse. He also thought that Islam and Christianity are very close to each other. There are certain theological differences, but he thought in spirit and ethos, they were very similar to each other. And he thought, well, he himself knew quite a lot about Christianity, and he thought I should be educated in Christianity as well. So if you like, I was brought up with two religious backgrounds, which have kind of jostled with each other. And I try and actually honor my dad's Islam and his personal devotion, as well as his kind of liberal take on Islam, liberal in the way that I just mentioned, namely that he was so keen that I should be educated in Christianity so that I would have, as it were, more religious literacy, but also that I would see in ways that Islam and Christianity were similar as well as different. He thought that was an important piece of education to have. So that's what I mean when I say liberal. So I try and honor that I would say in my work in certain respects, certainly in terms of an orientation, obviously not in detail necessarily, but in terms of a kind of personal orientation. About you saying not tackling extremism, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but then you go on to say that we're trying to undermine positive influence of faith communities. I wonder if there's some kind of typo here, that you missed out some word, because I would say that we're doing exactly the opposite. And we're often accused by other people. I certainly have been accused at various times by other people of giving too much latitude in my kind of normative and political arguments, giving too much latitude to a putative, benign influence of religion and of organized faith. So I don't understand the latter. I would say I'm very sympathetic to faith communities, and I would certainly say our book is. Certainly there's nothing negative there's nothing in there that undermines the positive influence of faith communities.
But given that, I realize we're past 10 past 2, and I would like to thank you for a wonderful conversation. We all look forward to delving deeper into the book. Thank you, Joe, for joining us and also turning on your camera, and looking forward to the next opportunity to discuss these issues, which will be with us for the foreseeable future. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice afternoon here in Toronto, evening in the UK and elsewhere.